Gambinos, no crime family in America has been as powerful, as wealthy, or as treacherous. The founder, Carlo Gambino, had the intelligence of a fox, the strength of a lion, and the nose of a hawk.
This guy was calling the shots, and those shots ended in murder.
How he himself avoided being murdered is an astonishing mystery to me.
He ruled quietly, controlling so many rackets in New York City, he had more power than the mayor. His successor, Paul Castellano, a pampered businessman who had not paid his dues on the street.
Guys who had been in the trenches, robbing and stealing and killing and hijacking and everything, you know, for years said, hey, what about me?
The new boss was lonely and fearful.
When I say to him, why you are very lonely? He said, I only have money in my pocket. People like me die in the street.
He knew all too well. Then came a Gambino boss straight from Central Casting.
You know, I always feel good when John Gotti walked into a restaurant dressed impeccably. It was an event, and everybody stopped and looked around.
And John Gotti tells Sammy, see what I tell you? Everybody loves us.
But in the end, the dapper Don would take the family down in flames.
You know they're going to try and keep you in jail. They say you're a danger while you're out.
100 years ago, well-dressed men rode carriages through the quaint cobblestone streets that wind through the city of Palermo, Sicily, and converge on its ancient town square. Many of these well-dressed men belonged to the Mafia, otherwise known as the Honored Society, a criminal brotherhood that used codes of honor, millions of lira, and above all, violence to control every aspect of daily life throughout Sicily. These so-called men of respect had been a law unto themselves for centuries. So it's no surprise that Palermo has been the birthplace of many powerful mafia bosses. On August 24th, 1902, a boy was born who one day would build the most powerful crime syndicate in the world. His name was Carlo Gambino. Carlo was born into a prosperous and well-connected family. Many of his relatives were in the Mafia. Carlo grew up sheltered by the Mafia in a part of the city so dominated by the Honored Society that it was off limits even to police and the military. Like others his age, young Carlo looked up to his Mafia elders. The men of respect had everything a man could want: power and money. They were treated like royalty. As a teenager, Carlo watched them stroll along the streets of the city in their beautifully tailored suits.
All the men would take off their hats to them, doff their hats, and the women would curtsy and kiss their hands. And he said, my God, how can you get to be one of these guys?
The man who made the biggest impression on young Carlo was the head of the Honored Society and one of the most powerful men in Sicily, Don Vito Cascioferro. Don Vito was both charismatic and fearless, but it was his criminal intuition that Carlo idolized most. Don Vito perfected the art of extortion. Where earlier mafiosi had pillaged and destroyed the businesses who would not cooperate with them, Don Vito saw a greater opportunity. In charging moderate fees for mafia protection, the businessmen could operate without fear, so long as they paid Don Vito his share. The energetic and ambitious Carlo wanted to be part of the action. He dropped out of school as a teenager and with the help of his family's connections, got a job as an enforcer for Don Vito. If a businessman failed to pay his protection money on time, Carlo would arrange an accident. For a young criminal, Carlo's looks were hardly threatening. He was only 5'7", of average build, and he did not parade around in fancy suits. His only intimidating feature was his prominent nose, which looked like a hawk's beak. He also had a mischievous grin which became his trademark. Carlo was shy and reserved, yet he lived by a creed which would take him to the top of a criminal empire.
One of the great lines that he uttered was, you have to be like a lion and a fox. The fox is smart enough to recognize traps, and the lion is strong enough to scare away the wolves. Be like a lion and a fox, and, no one will ever beat you.
Carlo proved to Don Vito and other men of respect that he was both a lion and a fox, carrying out all their orders with ruthlessness and cunning.
They immediately recognized in Carlo a superior intelligence. He was known as a man of great shrewdness from an early age. It's a quality in Italy which they call furberia, shrewdness, the kind of intelligence needed to pull off major crimes.
At the age of 19, Carlo's hard work and efforts were rewarded with a formal induction into the honored society. His boyhood dream come true. But now, events outside Palermo would begin to shape his life. In the early 1920s, fascism was gaining popularity throughout Italy. Its leader, Benito Mussolini, had little tolerance for the honored society. One of his objectives? To destroy the mafia.
So a lot of young mafiosi thought that there's no future here. They'll end up in jail, and if they had any connections in America, they used them.
And Carlo had plenty of them. Part of his mother's family, the Castellanos, a powerful mafia clan, had already moved to New York. With his future at home in jeopardy, he set his sights on America, where his New York relatives could introduce him to a criminal life full of golden opportunities. So, on a November day in 1921, the young Carlo was smuggled aboard a freighter bound for America. His family had paid the captain a substantial sum to escort the privileged young man across the Atlantic. A month later, the ship pulled into Norfolk, Virginia, with a cargo of wine, anchovies, and olives. Dressed in his Sunday best, one lone passenger slowly emerged. Carlo Gambino, all of 19 years old, had arrived.
And he strutted off as if he owned the world, and he was met by his Castellano relatives who whisked him up to New York. He made him a spectacular entry into the United States. It wasn't some scruffy little mobster. He was treated as a prince.
A prince with princely ambitions, and he would let nothing and no one stand in his way. Just before Christmas 1921, the teenaged Carlo Gambino set foot on American soil and began moving up the mafia ladder of success the old-fashioned way, through hard work and violence. But Carlo had a leg up on other gangsters of his generation. His American relatives, already members of New York's bustling underworld, rented him a small apartment near the Brooklyn waterfront. They wasted no time in introducing Carlo to the rackets. It was the era of Prohibition, and the public was thirsty for illegal booze. All over America, organized crime was supplying it and reaping the profits. Some of New York's busiest bootleggers were Carlo's first cousins, the Castellanos.
The Castellano family had a small trucking business. The truck, naturally, like so many other small trucking businesses, was used to transport booze. So he became, in effect, a rum runner. And Gambino was both a driver and sometimes he would serve as a shotgun because different bootleg gangs used to hijack each other's trucks.
In his new criminal career, Carlo met one of the local mafia leaders, Joe the Boss Masseria. This old-time Sicilian man of respect ran a big bootlegging racket. Carlo, sensing an opportunity to move ahead, went to work for Masseria.
Carlo was just a very acute businessman and organizer, and he soon became indispensable to whoever he was working for.
But Gambino was treacherous at heart. He knew that clinging to a single boss could mark him for death by a rival gang. Besides, his own driving ambition left no room for lasting loyalty to anyone, including Joe the Boss. In the early 1930s, Carlo's boss was locked in a bloody turf war with a longtime Sicilian rival named Salvatore Maranzano. The younger gangsters, including Carlo, thought the battle was tearing the mafia apart. One of Carlo's friends, Lucky Luciano, devised a clever plan to eliminate the boss. Lucky told Carlo about it and made him an offer.
And Charlie Lucky said, look, well, you got an option. You can come with us, and we're going to be the winning side. This was a war that was going on.
Carlo the Fox quietly supported Lucky's plan. In doing so, he positioned himself for future leadership with little personal risk.
Carlo's motivation became the motivation of practically everybody in those days. Get as rich as you can, as fast as you can. And don't worry about all the old rules and codes of the Sicilian Mafia.
On April 15th, 1931, Luciano invited Masseria to lunch at a Coney Island restaurant. As Lucky excused himself from the table, 4 gunmen walked in and put an end to Joe the boss. With the murder of Masseria, a number of his men, including Carlo Gambino, joined forces with the new boss, Salvatore Maranzano, but not for long.
Maranzano was very happy to have these really smart, bright young thugs working for him. What Maranzano didn't realize is that those bright young thugs were plotting his murder so they could take over everything. And that's what they did.
On orders from Charlie Lucky, Maranzano was shot and stabbed to death in his office. A new generation, led by Luciano, was now in charge, and Carlo had played his cards just right. Cards being dealt by Carlo's friend Luciano, who turned the underworld into a corporation, with each major gang getting a vote on the board of directors. Carlo was assigned to the boss who controlled the Brooklyn waterfront, Vincent Mangano. From there, Carlo began plotting a course to create his own criminal empire. Under Mangano, Gambino learned to run a variety of mob rackets, ranging from loan sharking to numbers to cargo theft.
He was a good earner for the mob and therefore entitled to respect. And the bottom line in any mafia endeavor, whatever it is how much money do you make? Profit is of the supreme importance.
Carlo's knack for business soon paid off. Just 29 years old, he earned a promotion to capo, or captain, in charge of his own crew. One of the first men he chose for the crew was his teenage cousin, Paul Castellano. The son of a Brooklyn numbers runner, Paul was also born into organized crime. Carlo, having learned firsthand how mafia wars are waged, knew that a mobster should be wary of his underlings. And he knew he could trust Paul, a blood relative. The less time Gambino spent watching his back, the more time he could devote to planning his rise to power.
He only really trusted the people who had been with him all his life. And he built up this little wall where nobody could get in who wasn't a blood relative.
Blood ties would be of the highest significance to Carlo throughout his life. Some would say too significant. In 1932, at the age of 30, he solidified his bond with the Castellano family when he took the unorthodox step of marrying Paul Castellano's sister, Catherine.
It was amazing that Carlo Gambino married Catherine Castellano because she was his first cousin. And as a good Catholic, you're not supposed to do that. But the Castellanos were extremely powerful in the mafia. He multiplied his power, and that's what he was after.
Carlo and Catherine settled into a modest Brooklyn row house. Together they raised 3 sons and a daughter. By all accounts, Carlo was a devoted husband and family man. But marriage and family could not curb his appetite for power and money. The repeal of Prohibition in 1933 brought harder times for many mobsters, drying up their lucrative bootlegging operations. But Carlo saw a new path to profit in a new racket, contraband liquor. By dodging liquor taxes, Carlo could undercut his legitimate competitors. With this scheme, Carlo made the first of his several fortunes. His success did not go unnoticed by the law. In 1937, he was convicted of tax evasion in connection with running a 1 million-gallon illegal still in Philadelphia. But Carlo somehow managed to beat the rap. He got off with a suspended sentence. By 1941, with America entering World War II, Carlo was busy devising ways to make money off it. As part of the war effort, the government began rationing essential goods like meat, chocolate, nylons, and gasoline. Government-issued ration stamps were as good as gold, so Gambino and his crew found ways to steal them and hoard them. When the government began protecting the ration stamps by storing them in banks, Gambino simply bribed corrupt officials to steal them for him. It wasn't long before Carlo made his next black market million. But he would not stop there. Carlo saw opportunities everywhere, including a business few mobsters would touch, gay bars.
He didn't personally go in there and pat people on the ass. He realized that a lot of gay men were lawyers, doctors, everything, and these people at that time were much more susceptible to blackmail than they are now. This wasn't that they were supporting the gay lifestyle. They were supporting their own lifestyle, and they were blackmailing a lot of people.
By the 1950s, Carlo had established an excellent reputation as a big earner for the Mangano crime family, but his path to further advancement seemed blocked. In 1951, his boss, Vincent Mangano, mysteriously disappeared. Many suspected that Mangano's underboss and Carlo's rival, Albert Anastasia, was responsible. Anastasia took control of the crime family. Nicknamed the Lord High Executioner, Anastasia was one of the most feared gangsters of his time. He headed up the infamous mafia hit squad known as Murder Incorporated. Though Anastasia made Carlo his underboss in 1956, Carlo knew he was unlikely to ever become boss through natural succession. He and Anastasia were both in their mid-50s. Anastasia could easily outlive him. Unlike his boss, Carlo Gambino was selective in his use of violence. But when he saw no other way, he would not hesitate to kill. Carlo was determined to reach the top, so Anastasia had to go. It was that simple. Carlo set up the hit. On October 25th, 1957, Anastasia went for a shave at his usual barber shop at the Park Sheraton Hotel in Midtown Manhattan. As a hot towel was placed over his face, two gunmen rushed in and shot him 5 times, the last bullet penetrating his brain. Now, no one stood in Carlo's way. He was the boss. His wits and tenacity had gotten him to the top of the Mangano crime family. Soon, he would transform that family into his very own Gambino dynasty. By the age of 55, Carlo Gambino had finally achieved his lifelong ambition to become boss of a crime family. He had connived and killed his way to the top. Now it was time to exploit his power in the service of that most basic mafia principle, breaking the law to make money. The crime family, which now bore his name, already controlled the Brooklyn waterfront. But, like any good executive, Carlo knew the future lay in diversification. He expanded into a wide range of rackets: gambling, construction bid rigging, loan sharking, even securities fraud on Wall Street. In 1962, Carlo once again used bloodlines to strengthen his hold on organized crime. He arranged the marriage of his eldest son, Tommy, to the daughter of fellow New York crime boss, Thomas Lucchese. The marriage soon gave Gambino access to yet another lucrative and more modern racket.
Lucchese started doing a tremendous business by hijacking freight from JFK Airport, corrupting the unions that handle freight. And then he cut his friend Carlo Gambino in on that racket because Carlo Gambino's son had married his daughter.
Gambino had infiltrated what had become the nation's greatest port of entry, and the cash poured in. His men bribed airport employees to tip them off when valuable shipments were arriving. Gambino drivers were there to haul them away. Gambino expanded his criminal empire by taking control of yet another racket, extorting the New York garment industry, an industry responsible for 70% of all the clothes sold in the U.S. By infiltrating the small but powerful truckers' unions, Gambino could effectively demand a percentage of every garment sold. If the businesses did not pay up, their goods would not get to market. Following the old mafia tradition of secrecy, or omertà, Gambino conducted business in his Brooklyn home in code to foil any attempts by law enforcement to eavesdrop on his meetings.
If he and his capos met in the meeting room in his house to decide whether a certain guy should be killed or not, the scene would go something like this. One of the capos would get up and say, "Froggy legs," and Carlo would go like this. That meant the end of him. That meant that he'd be killed. You know. He would just nod his head. He would never open his mouth.
The tactic worked. Efforts to record Gambino came up empty.
He very rarely spoke at meetings, so it was hard to wiretap him. He was shrewd that way, and of course that was the successful way to be.
The boss also kept a low profile in his personal life. For all his wealth and power, he lived modestly and eluded the media.
Gambino was hard to get on your radar screen. He did not go bouncing at night. He didn't keep, a routine schedule. He was an elusive character, and I think very deliberately so. He was a low-profile character, and very successfully so, because his invisibility ultimately was his power.
Mr. Gambino, do you have any idea why you've been brought here?
His desire for anonymity aside, Gambino could not resist one public indulgence.
Here was a guy who went to so much trouble to live in the small, modest house. He went to so much trouble to not have the big, long, shiny black Cadillac. He kind of had this gray or dark, Oldsmobile. And the license plate was CG1, I think. But he had to allow himself that one little trapping of power, that one little vanity, the license plate with his initials. Back then, it showed you had a little juice.
By the mid-60s, Carlo was moving into his mid-60s, aging gracefully and looking more like a grandfather than a mafia godfather. He liked to give the appearance of a harmless, humble old immigrant.
I was at the Westchester Premier Theater, and I was introduced to Carlo Gambino. And he said, "Pleasure to meet you," very polite old gentleman. He spoke with a very heavy accent. He was wearing an overcoat, top hat. You would never know who he was. If it wasn't brought to your attention, you'd say, "Oh, a nice little old Italian man."
If you met Carlo Gambino, you would say, "This guy looks like Geppetto, the shoemaker with Pinocchio." His demeanor was so low-key and so grandfatherly. It was incredible he was what he was.
One sign of Carlo's high-powered business life was his strong addiction to coffee. When he went to these cafes, he drank from a bottomless cup.
I couldn't believe that anybody could drink that kind of black coffee and not get a jolt of adrenaline that would drive you over a cliff. He told me how many cups he used to drink a day. He used to drink a dozen cups of black coffee a day.
The outwardly mild manner did not fool those who knew Carlo well, allies and enemies alike.
Carlo Gambino, his middle name was Treachery. He was the most treacherous mafia boss of them all. He would not hesitate to kill someone who would help him very much.
By the late 60s, the Gambino crime family had swelled to 25 crews with a total of about 800 men. Carlo Gambino had arguably become the most powerful man in all of New York.
You think that a man who never became an American citizen, who never got out of high school in Italy, could assemble this gigantic empire worth millions and millions and millions of dollars, a conglomeration of rackets, 30, 40, 50 rackets during his lifetime, and it took some brains.
The Don had earned the respect of those around him, and they were careful to show it. When in Little Italy, he always stopped by Ferrara's bakery for espressos and cannoli. There he would hold court, dispensing advice and favors.
Talk about patronizing somebody. I mean, the people would come in, they would fall all over themselves to kiss his ring. It would be like visiting the Pope.
In one of his rare nights on the town, Carlo took in a performance by Frank Sinatra at the Westchester Theater. Sinatra may have been the star, but it was Gambino who received the royal treatment.
Sinatra invited him and his entire group into the dressing room between the two shows Sinatra was putting on. The second show was going to start like at, say, 10 o'clock, for example. Right? It started at 10:40 that night because Sinatra didn't want to chase him out of the room. I mean, it was that kind of respect. It was something.
Carlo's dedication to the crime family was matched by his devotion to his other family at home. To insulate his eldest son, Tommy, from his own violent world, Carlo sent him to Manhattan College, a rarity among the sons and daughters of mob bosses. Carlo was extremely close to his wife, Catherine, who never asked too many questions and, in her own way, proved quite an asset to the boss. Her warmth softened even the toughest wise guys who came to call on Gambino.
She would offer you an espresso coffee, and she would invariably ask you how your family was and how your charming children were. She completely disarmed you, you know. She melted you. You were going to go in there pretty tough, you know, try to make a deal or scare the boss. And by the time you left Catherine Gambino, you were a marshmallow.
Catherine helped Carlo keep the appearance of a decorous and respectable household. But mere appearance could not fool the feds. They knew Gambino was the biggest crook in the country, and they kept his home under constant surveillance.
There was a marked police car parked in front, right in front, and on the door it said, Organized Crime Control Bureau. A marked police car with two plainclothesmen sitting in it. And this was the police department's way of saying, okay, you know, this is our harassment. You know, we're telling everybody, all your neighbors, who you are.
The end of the 60s marked the beginning of the decline in Gambino's fortunes. In 1969, a Gambino associate by the name of John Gotti and his brother Gene were caught hijacking a cargo truck at JFK Airport. The incident didn't disrupt family business for long, but it brought more unwelcome attention to the Godfather. A year later, Carlo was again in the spotlight. The boss was charged with masterminding an armed robbery.
They were holding up armored cars, Chase Manhattan armored cars, and he was actually arrested, indicted and arrested, and was supposed to go to trial.
Carlo and his attorneys succeeded in getting one delay after another. But the law was not Carlo's only worry. His wife, Catherine, had been diagnosed with cancer. In 1971, she died. Carlo's troubles were not over. Frustrated with delays in the armed robbery case, the government pushed to deport Gambino to Sicily as an illegal alien. But each time he was about to be sent back to Sicily, Carlo's heart troubles would conveniently get worse. When doctors finally gave feds the green light, Gambino's connections stepped in to save the day.
They were all set to deport him, and all of a sudden word comes down blocking this. Gambino's people made a deal with two very powerful congressmen. And the deal was that they would be paid $1,000 a month for life if Gambino was allowed to stay here.
And Carlo was allowed to stay. But the years had taken a toll on him. As his heart weakened, he grew increasingly frail. On October 15th, 1976, Carlo died of a heart attack while watching a New York Yankees game at his summer home on Long Island.
How he himself avoided being murdered is an astonishing mystery to me, because he had harmed so many tough mafia bosses, and yet no one ever laid a hand on him.
Carlo Gambino had successfully led the crime family for 20 years and left a criminal dynasty that would far outlive him, all without serving a single day in prison. His funeral was a spectacle, drawing mourners from all over New York and around the country.
My guess is there were thousands and thousands and thousands of people who walked through there and paid their respects. I mean, he was a legend.
After the death of the patriarch, the search for a new direction would carve a bloody trail through the Gambino crime family. Following the death of boss Carlo Gambino, there was strife within the crime family, strife which Carlo himself created. Just before his death, Carlo had picked a successor. In making this fateful decision about the future of his criminal empire, Carlo, like the mythical King Lear, set off a chain of events that would eventually bring the family down. His own sons were not in the running. None of them had positions of sufficient seniority in the family. But bloodlines were still paramount to Carlo, so he chose his 61-year-old first cousin and brother-in-law, Paul Castellano. Big Paulie, as he was known, was more a businessman than a street mobster.
He wasn't a button man, he didn't kill anybody, and so what does he know? You know, he's never been a loan shark, and so what does he know?
But Paul was family. A half-century earlier, the powerful Castellano clan back in Sicily had helped Carlo get a foothold in the New York underworld. Now, Carlo had shown his gratitude, but he had chosen the wrong man. Paul, 13 years younger than his cousin Carlo, was born in Brooklyn in 1915. His father, a butcher, ran numbers for mob-controlled bookies. Paul dropped out of school in the 8th grade. He learned to be a meat cutter and began helping his father in the numbers racket. Paul was attracted to a life in the mafia, not out of any personal taste for violence, but out of greed.
There was no real reason why he had to have a life of crime. He grew up in a middle-class to laboring-class Italian neighborhood where there was not a great deal of crime. That was partly what his relative did, and it was a chance to make more money.
In 1934, at the age of 19, Paul and two of his buddies botched an armed robbery in Brooklyn. Paul's cohorts got away, but he was arrested. The police questioned him for hours, yet Paul wouldn't rat on his partners in crime. He served 3 months in jail. When he got out, the story made the rounds about how Paul had kept his mouth shut, and he became a hero among the thugs in his neighborhood. He was noticed by made men in the mob. With his connection to the Mangano family through his cousin Carlo, young Paul was initiated into La Cosa Nostra. When he was 22, Paul took after Carlo in another way. He used marriage to solidify his ties to organized crime. He married a distant cousin of his who just happened to be Carlo's sister-in-law. Her name, Nina Mano.
She was the typical Italian lady. You walked into her house, she had a house dress on. She was talking about what she was going to make that night for dinner. Very simple lady.
Paul and Nina had 4 children, 3 sons and a daughter. While Paul had joined the mafia, he didn't give up his legitimate career. In fact, by the early 50s, he owned a lucrative wholesale meat company. By all outward appearances, he was an upstanding businessman, dressing well and driving a sleek Buick convertible. But out of the office, Paul stayed close to his cousin Carlo and earned his trust. During the long reign of his cousin Carlo, Paul became a captain in the family. He was a key player in the boss's plan to diversify the mafia and develop the so-called white rackets. Construction bid rigging, union infiltration, and political corruption.
And of course, you know, that didn't go over with the meat and potatoes thieves, you know, down at the bottom, because they didn't know how to do that.
So by 1976, when Carlo died and Big Paulie was suddenly named boss, he was seen as someone who rose to the top, not because he had paid his dues on the street, but because of his relationship to Carlo.
He was the mob's version of Little Lord Fauntleroy. I mean, you know, he came all dressed up neat and clean. He didn't have to get his hands dirty or bloody. And this empire was then given to him, given unto him as this great gift, where guys who had been in the trenches, robbing and stealing and killing and hijacking and everything, you know, for years said, hey, what about me?
Among the 800 or so gangsters who now made up the Gambino crime family, the more popular candidate to take over after Carlo was his second-in-command, or underboss, Neil Della Croce. Della Croce operated out of the Ravenite Social Club in Little Italy and ran the blue-collar faction of the family. Crimes like extortion, gambling, loan sharking, and whenever necessary, murder.
Della Croce, one of the scariest individuals I've ever met in my life. Della Croce's eyes were like he didn't have any eyes. You ever see that Children of the Damned? Like his eyes were so blue that they weren't even there. It was like looking right through him.
Della Croce was the epitome of the mafia's old school. He was a soldier who believed in the tradition of unquestioning loyalty. When he was passed over for the top job, he accepted his fate quietly, even if he was bitterly disappointed. Some of Della Croce's thugs, including the ambitious John Gotti, did not accept the decision so lightly.
Gotti was an upstart. Gotti was like, what do you mean, so it shall be? You know, what about you? You were number two, you were in line.
But the new boss was no fool. He knew the blue-collar guys resented him, so he made peace with Della Croce and his gang by letting them control and profit from the street rackets they were running. Big Paulie looked down his nose at such activities and at men like John Gotti in their polyester suits. He preferred to dress like a banker and read the Wall Street Journal.
He thought of the Gambino crime family as a corporate entity with various investments, and he had numerous legitimate businesses that he could front, that were his cover, that were his way to respect in private industry as well as in organized crime. I think that the fact that he went to so much trouble to show that he was a legitimate businessman and not a gangster, that he transmitted such an air that he was, you know, not to be feared, that he was to be dealt with, negotiated with, lost him a lot of respect in the family.
If Paul resembled Carlo in wanting to modernize the mafia, he differed from him in essential ways. While the old boss had lived in a modest house in Brooklyn, Paul built himself a mansion on Staten Island. A mansion worth $3.5 million. He called it his White House.
The mansion was designed partly in imitation of the president's White House in Washington, to give you an idea of the size of the ego that Paul Castellano had. And there it sits on the top of Todd Hill, totally isolated from the life of the average mobster in the family, the copy who hung out at these clubs.
The new boss did not seem to appreciate the need to mix with the troops the way his predecessor had.
Carlo Gambino wasn't standoffish. He was approachable and he would listen. If he could do something for you, then he would do it. Castellano was a lot more arrogant.
Castellano preferred to spend his time dining with Fortune 500 executives at Manhattan steakhouses like Sparks, where the staff catered to his every desire.
He used to go into Sparks and tell them what cut of meat he wanted them to cut because of his butcher background.
People would be falling all over themselves to wait on him. He may get 8 waiters at his table. He was spoiled.
Back at his White House, Paul was leading a life of deception. Though his marriage to Carlo Gambino's sister-in-law had served him well politically in the mafia, it was an unhappy one. Paul suffered from diabetes, and it was said that one of the side effects was sexual impotence.
Mrs. Nina and Mr. Paul were all the time sleep in their separate rooms. Sometimes they used to speak nice and, you know, they have a good times together, watching TV, playing cards, and sometimes they don't speak at all by a week or 2 weeks.
Feeling lonely and isolated, Paul turned to his young Colombian maid for solace. He gave her these toy clowns, telling Gloria it was her duty to make him smile.
I asked him, why you want that I smile for you? Why do you want I be like a clown of the day? Then he said, because I am very lonely. Because I only have money in my pocket. And because I don't have love.
To his soldiers on the street who heard rumors about the affair, it was Paul who was acting like the clown. In order to consummate his relationship with Gloria properly, Paul got a penile implant. His wife left him.
It was frowned on by everybody. All his copy knew he was making an ass out of himself. He lost a great deal of respect in his own family, in the mafia family.
As the Gambino family members lost more and more respect for the boss, they began to fear him less, and then to hate him. One man in particular carried that hate around like a badge of honor, John Gotti. In the early 1980s, Gambino crime boss Paul Castellano lived a double life. balancing his status as a prosperous and legitimate businessman against his role as New York's most powerful mafia godfather. At his secluded White House on Staten Island, Paul surrounded himself with his trusted capos. Yet, with all his power and prestige, Paul admitted to his maid and lover, Gloria Olarte, the loneliness and fear that came with running a crime family.
And one day he said to me, I want to be happy, I want you to make me happy, because people like me die in the street.
Paul and Gloria would often cook Italian food together. Then Paul, who had a ravenous appetite, would sit down to eat.
He normally spent 4 or 5 hours and eat anything, the meat, the spaghetti, the vegetable, the coffee, the cake, the cookies. He never stopped to eat.
Paul could also be gluttonous as a crime boss. He began demanding a bigger piece of the action from each of his 24 crews. The typical 10% of a crew's earnings wasn't enough for Paul. He wanted 15%.
If there's a $500,000 score and he only gets $50,000, he goes crazy. How come I'm only getting 10%? He'd fly off the handle about who's running this. He didn't do anything, but he's the boss, so he should get more.
And he certainly wasn't shy about voicing his dissatisfaction if his Christmas present wasn't big enough, if the envelope wasn't thick enough, if a certain crew didn't come up with enough money at the end of a week because they didn't make that much. He didn't expect that to cut into his end.
Paul's excessive greed, even by mob standards, was not the only character flaw alienating him from his own crime family. He persisted in snubbing the blue-collar faction of the family, headed by his underboss, Neil Della Croce. The crews complained to each other, but that was about all they could do. It was no use telling their boss, Neil Della Croce, who oversaw many of the crews and was considered a hoodlum's hoodlum. Della Croce just wanted to keep the peace and keep the boss happy.
If $200,000 came in from a construction project, he would go up to the White House and give $100,000 to Big Paul, because he believed that the boss is the boss is the boss.
Big Paul certainly shared that view of himself. He demanded respect and was not above using his powers of intimidation to make that point, even to total strangers.
He drove his wife to a supermarket one day, and he said some young thug kind of kids cut him off and screamed at him out the car and gave him gestures, the profane gestures with the hands and all. And he quietly took down the plate and then sent some young men in his organization over to get these kids, and they brought them to the house. And he said, "Do you know who I am now?" So they said yes, and they were trembling and they were frightened. He said, "Nobody's going to hurt you. I just want you to know that if you see an old man driving in a car, you shouldn't think that it's okay to make profane gestures. You better never do it again." And they were frightened to death, and he let them out of the house. But that was Paul Castellano. Some of the others might have given them a beating or physically abused them or done worse. But he was trying to give them a lesson, and it was an interesting lesson, I thought.
But while the boss was teaching lessons in respect to young punks, the ever-growing disrespect for Castellano within the crime family was becoming poisonous. In the roaring 80s, Manhattan was in a furious building boom, and Big Paul was getting a huge cut from it all as contractors paid a mom tax to get their concrete delivered. It made the Gambinos rich. It also helped make construction costs in New York the highest in the nation. Big Paul wanted to make sure no one in the family disrupted the safe money-making machine. One crew Paul kept his eye on was John Gotti's at the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club in Queens. Gotti, who was now a capo, was letting it be known he wanted a bigger piece of the action in the cargo hijacking racket at JFK. And there were rumors Gotti's crew was involved in drug trafficking, a crime the boss told his men never to get into.
The kind of unsophisticated crews like John Gotti's crew were looked on as, possible career threateners, because these are the guys, they're going to get us in the papers, they're going to get locked up, they're, involved in drugs. This is bad news for us. We've got big things cooking here.
Gotti would complain about Big Paul's attitude toward him, saying, That guy, Big Paul, he's a stuffed shirt. He thinks he's a big boss, and all he is a pain in the neck.
Paul knew Gotti was unhappy, but he didn't seem to care. The boss was thinking about splitting the Bergen crew up anyway. They just weren't fitting in with the new business plan, and the manpower could be used elsewhere. It would be a fatal mistake, and it would cost Castellano his life. Just as Carlo Gambino had come to power 30 years earlier in a violent coup, John Gotti and other members of the Gambino family would soon begin plotting the same kind of bloody takeover. While Gambino crime boss Paul Castellano played the part of the well-dressed New York businessman, he was no stranger to violence, mafia style. Paul knew when it was time to kill, but he preferred deal-making to murder. Nothing showed that side of Paul's character better than the way he dealt with a gang of Irish thugs known as the Westies. The Westies operated out of Manhattan's West Side neighborhood known as Hell's Kitchen, where they were into labor racketeering, extortion, drugs, and murder for hire. The Westies wanted to eliminate the competition on their turf. They began roughing up, robbing, kidnapping, and killing mafia associates, including allies of the Gambino family. Big Paulie, in a move that reflected his style of mafia deal-making, called a meeting at his favorite restaurant in Brooklyn, Tommaso's. He invited the leaders of the Westies, Jimmy Coonan and Mickey Featherstone. Castellano did not arrange to have the two Irish gangsters killed, as some other mob bosses might have done. Instead, he made them an offer they could not refuse. In exchange for 10% of their earnings on the street, Paul gave the Westies permission to use his name and the name of the Gambino crime family on the west side of Manhattan. Paul's only caveat was that if the Westies wanted anyone killed, permission had to come first from the Gambinos. The Westies took the deal. Then, in the fall of '78, New York police detectives were stymied in their investigations of several West Side homicides. Witnesses wouldn't talk because they had heard Paul Castellano's name in connection with the crimes. The Westies were milking the privilege to use Paul's name for all it was worth. That's when the police decided to go straight to Paul. Paul agreed to meet with the police, but on his own turf, in Tommaso's restaurant.
Paul Castellano walks through the door with his entourage, with about 6 or 7 what we call jabeeps, with the mafia uniform, the gold chains, the pointed shoes, the camel hair coats, you know, the hair, the whole bit.
Paul and the police were taken to the rear dining room, and the people eating there were moved so Paul and his interrogators could be alone.
Discussing the problem. Problem being, I want you to cut the cord with the Irish kids on the West Side because and they're denigrating you, and you know, I'm trying to use a little psychology with him. And he listens, and he admits to me that he knows them, and he tells me, yes, they're nice little Irish kids, you know. So we have our conversation. At the end of the conversation, he says, by the way, he says, I just built a new home in Staten Island. I'd like you and your wife to come as my guests for the housewarming. I said, are you crazy?
Paul had no interest in cooperating with the police, but to protect himself, he told the Westies to stop using his name specifically. Too much money was coming out of Hell's Kitchen to stop anything just because the cops asked for Paul's help. So the murder and mayhem continued, and Castellano kept collecting his tithe. But the most violent gang connected to Paul was a crew within the Gambino family, run by a serial killer named Roy DeMeo. DeMeo and his gang specialized in loan sharking, narcotics, and their peculiar talent, murder for hire.
What they would do is lure you into a spot. You'd be shot in the head with a silencer or a quick pistol. They would wrap a towel around your head real quick so the blood wouldn't go all over the place. And then they would hang you upside down and bleed you, and then dismember the body, box it, bag it, and the next morning you were under 30 tons of garbage in the fountain avenue dump. And they probably did in excess of 250 murders.
Paul happily collected his due from their profits and used the DeMeo crew to carry out hits. One of the hits Paul ordered was on his own son-in-law and Gambino soldier, Frank Amato. Amato was married to Paul's daughter, Connie.
He go crazy by Miss Connie. He love it. Miss Connie is the only daughter he had. Every time he talk about Miss Connie, his eyes light up.
In 1980, Paul heard rumors that his son-in-law was fooling around with other women and beating up Connie, who was pregnant at the time. When Connie suffered a miscarriage, Paul blamed Frank and ordered DeMeo to kill him. On September 20th, 1980, Frank Amato disappeared. His body was never found and the crime was never solved. Over the next 2 years, Paul let DeMeo and his crew do as they pleased. As long as he got his cut on time, Paul was happy. But in 1982, Paul got word the feds were investigating DeMeo's activities, specifically drug dealing and dozens of murders. Paul summoned DeMeo to a strategy session to deal with the investigation. DeMeo didn't show up, so Paul had him killed. DeMeo's body was found in the trunk of his own car on January 10th, 1983. So, behind the facade of the well-dressed Manhattan businessman was a ruthless mob boss. And while Castellano's excessive greed, as well as his affair with his maid, were losing him respect within the Gambino family, no one doubted his willingness to use violence. In fact, as tensions within the family grew worse, those who knew they had alienated the boss, including John Gotti, realized that the best way to save their own lives was to strike first. The downfall of Gambino boss Paul Castellano can be traced to an ambitious underling and an unwitting lover. In March 1983, the FBI was eager to plant bugs inside Paul's Staten Island mansion. But the agents needed to know exactly where in the house Paul sat and held court.
If they have a bug in the kitchen, and they talk in the kitchen most of the time, and then all of a sudden when they have something really critical to say, like they're going to kill somebody, and they go out on the porch, you're screwed. That's where the maid came in.
Paul's maiden lover, Gloria Olarte, was no stranger to the FBI. Agents would stop her while she was running errands and offer to buy her coffee, just to see if they could get any information out of her. Gloria had told Paul about it, and he'd given her only one piece of advice.
Don't worry, be careful. If he asks you something, answer whatever you have to answer. Don't lie, please don't lie.
One day, Gloria casually mentioned to an agent that Mr. Paul, as she called him, sat at the kitchen table where he talked on the phone and held his meetings. Gloria had no idea she had just told them where to plant the bug. But Paul didn't make things easy for the FBI. He protected his home with a state-of-the-art security system, a high wrought iron fence, and a Rottweiler named Duke, who roamed the 3.5-acre estate. So the FBI sent an agent to Paul's house posing as a repairman. At the time, Paul, Gloria, and Paul's driver, Tommy Bellotti, were all in the house. In fact, Bellotti hovered over the agent, watching every move.
Here you got the agent who's got this known killer is watching over him. So right while he was standing there, watching him, guarding him, standing guard, the agent installed the microphone and thinking he was fixing what he was supposed to be fixing.
With the bug planted, the FBI began the task of monitoring Paul's day-to-day life. Over the next 4.5 months, the FBI recorded over 600 hours of conversations.
I think 70% of those tapes were recipes and conversations. Somebody should have made a cookbook out of it, you know. But we were facing some not very nice conversations in the sense that they were clearly talking about business and how they were going to slice up business.
With the audio tapes rolling, Paul outlined mafia business, badmouthed other family bosses, and made loving asides to his maid. He was digging a hole for himself and the entire New York mafia. Then, a family crisis centered on the John Gotti crowd. On August 23, 1983, 8 Gambino soldiers, including Gotti's friend Angelo Ruggiero and Gotti's younger brother Gene, were arrested for smuggling heroin. Most of the evidence came from the FBI's tap on the Long Island home of Angelo Ruggiero, nicknamed Quack Quack because he talked so much.
Angelo was one of the biggest talkers you ever wanted to find. Angelo would go up to visit Paul Castellano on Sundays with Neil Della Croce and John Gotti. And Castellano would talk about a lot of things. So Angelo would come back and he would start to talk about what happened up there at these meetings. We couldn't believe it. He would talk about everything. He's the kind of guy, if he hears something, he has to let you know that he is in on what's going on. So he'd come and he would brag about it. And that's perfect for what we want.
The FBI knew the tapes could easily prove that Paul Castellano ran the Gambino crime family. Paul was still in the dark about this, but was furious with Gotti and his crew for breaking the family rule against dealing drugs.
Oh, I don't think there's any question that Paul Castellano thought about killing John Gotti and Angelo Ruggiero. It's unclear if he would have. Paul Castellano was not as trigger-happy as John Gotti was. Maybe not for any benevolent reason, but because murder does have a way of bringing heat from law enforcement officials.
Paul was desperate to learn if he had been implicated on the Ruggiero tapes. So he demanded that the crew leader, Neil Della Croce, bring a copy of the wiretap evidence to him at his White House. A copy that had now been provided to the Gambino men awaiting trial. The boss wanted to hear the tapes for himself. Even now, the feds were still listening in, this time on a bug they had planted in the bedroom of Neil Della Croce. By this point, Neil was dying of brain cancer.
And here was John Gotti and Angelo standing there at Neil's deathbed while the tapes were turning and the FBI was listening in.
I'm going to tell you something. If you two never bother with me again in the rest of my life, I ain't giving them tapes up. I can't. There's good friends of mine on them tapes. Well, he's the boss. You have to do what he tells you.
That's why I said to you before, you don't understand what an usher. An usher means that the boss is your boss. Understand?
But Ruggiero wouldn't give the tapes up, fearing that would mean death for him and the other soldiers who had been dealing drugs. Della Croce didn't want to go to war over the tapes and stalled for time. The heads of the other mafia families in New York watched to see how Paul would discipline his own men. But before he could make a decision, Paul was arrested on March 30th, 1984, and charged with 51 counts of racketeering for sanctioning the killing of 25 people, stealing cars, and selling drugs. At the courthouse, Paul was out of his element.
If you looked at the man, the charges were somewhat out of place. And I remember being in the hallway of the courthouse. I walked right up to him. He was a big guy. He must have been 6'5" or something. And I stuck out my hand and said, "How do you do, Mr. Castellano? John Miller." And I remember he put out his hand, and I grabbed this big hand, and I remember it was very sweaty, clammy. It was like he was a nervous man, and you thought, well, gee, this guy runs the Gambino crime family. You know, if he presses a button, people get killed. You know, here he was nervous.
Paul was released on $2 million bond. He put on a brave face and tried to get back to business. Then the dam broke. On February 25th, 1985, Paul was arrested along with the bosses of New York's other crime families in what became known as the Commission case. The bosses, who all sat on the mob's board of directors or commission, were charged with racketeering in connection with shaking down New York building contractors and demanding a 2% tax on big cement jobs. Much of the evidence came from the FBI bug in Paul's kitchen.
He was in the back seat of the car being brought in for processing, and the newscast came over to the car radio that the FBI had just arrested the commission, and a lot of the information was based on a microphonic surveillance, a bug placed in Paul Castellano's house. He said, "Did you guys really bug my house?" And he was muttering something to himself about it. You know, he knew at that point that he was in big trouble.
There were rumors within the crime family that Big Paulie might cooperate with the government and become a rat. The kind of rumors that make mobsters reach for their guns. John Gotti wanted to kill Paul because he said the Gambino family would be better off without him. But Neil Della Croce, the ever-loyal underboss, wouldn't hear of it. Then on December 2nd, 1985, Neil Della Croce died from brain cancer. John Gotti was now in charge of the blue-collar wing. In the days following Neil's death, Paul's own actions sealed his doom. First, he announced to the family that he was breaking up Gotti's crew and reassigning them, punishment for the heroin dealing. Then, knowing the FBI was watching his every step, he skipped Della Croce's wake, a sign of disrespect in La Cosa Nostra.
Paul Castellano was a very shrewd and maneuvering kind of fellow, and he said that would be bad for business for me to show up there. So forget about Neil, forget about the wake, we'll send a card. And many in the Gambino family, most particularly John Gotti, would have said, hey, your own underboss and your lifelong friend dies, you throw all that out the window, you be a man. You go to the wake, you pay your respects.
That was the last straw for John Gotti. And with Della Croce dead, there was no one to stop him for putting his coup into action. First, Gotti won over a longtime supporter of Castellano named Frank DeCicco. DeCicco agreed to help Gotti in exchange for being named underboss when Gotti took over. DeCicco went to work on the boss. He told Paul that the men were upset that he had snubbed Della Croce's wake. So DeCicco offered to arrange a dinner at Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan with Neil's son, Armand. DeCicco told Paul this would be his chance to pay his respects. The dinner was set for December 16th. After doing a little Christmas shopping and dropping off some gifts for the secretaries in his lawyer's office, Paul headed for Sparks around 5 p.m., escorted by his driver, Tommy Bellotti.
I think he was too trustworthy. That jaunt up to Sparks that evening, I think probably a street boss would have suspected something was going to happen because they were having problems.
When Paul and Tommy Bellotti pulled up to the curb outside Sparks Steakhouse, 4 men rushed the car and shot Paul and Tommy several times each in the head.
It was the ultimate disrespect. If you're going to kill a guy of Paul Castellano's stature, and you do it like that, you're telling him and everybody even remotely connected with him that, this is a slap. It's not just a murder. It's a slap at everything the guy stood for and everybody who was connected with him.
Within minutes of the hit, the cops had a list of likely suspects. At the top of that list was a 45-year-old gangster who wanted to bring back the good old days of La Cosa Nostra, John Gotti. Christmas 1985, just 9 days after the hit on boss Paul Castellano. Among the questions swirling within the ranks of the New York underworld and the FBI, who was the new boss of the Gambino crime family? The answer was soon apparent. In a stakeout across from the Ravenite Social Club on Little Italy's Mulberry Street, FBI agents watched as throngs of New York's top mafiosi lined up to kiss the cheek of the new man in charge, John Gotti.
All the captains got together. It was to vote John in as boss. And he was, unanimously voted in. The word is already out there. This is the guy who killed the last guy, and I think there was a real hunger for a guy like him in the family at that point.
At the age of 45, John Gotti had achieved his life's dream.
The brown Lincoln was traded for a black Mercedes that cost $70-something thousand. John Gotti was wearing $2,000 Brioni suits. He was wearing diamond pinky rings, and there were guys driving him and guys opening his doors for him and closing his doors for him.
Now he was the boss. John Joseph Gotti Jr., born October 27, 1940. He grew up in the South Bronx, one of 13 children, his parents barely scraping by. On the streets of the South Bronx, everybody knew about the mob. The well-dressed men flashing wads of bills and driving expensive cars. Young Gotti gazed at them with the same eyes as Carlo and Paul had done when they were boys.
John Gotti was drawn to the mob for the same reasons that everybody else is. The chance to make a quick, easy dollar, the influence, the power, the clout, driving the big-ass Cadillacs that all the other guys did around that time.
Growing up on the streets, John ran with the gangs, staking out turf in the neighborhood. A natural thug, John was soon running his own gang.
John Gotti was a tough guy. He was good with his fists. He was also a charismatic, born leader type. Even as a youngster, kids followed him, and he could get people to do what he wanted. He knew the buttons to push.
John and his friends hung around the Mafia Social Club in Brooklyn run by Carmine Fatigo, a capo first for Albert Anastasia and later for Carlo Gambino. From Carmine, John learned the coarse language of the mob.
The guy had the vocabulary of a sailor. No imagination at all. Every other word was F, or MF, or CS. I mean, it was incredible. He's a moron.
John set out to impress the wise guys by stealing. Once, when roaming the streets of Brooklyn, 14-year-old Gotti and his buddies tried stealing a cement mixer. When the mixer tipped over, it fell on John's left foot, crushing it. After that, he walked with a bounce.
It was one of those interesting characteristics of John Gotti that was not a put-on, not an act. He liked to carry himself with flair and with dignity, but that little special bounce that he had in his walk had to do with the incident back when he was a 14 or 15-year-old.
In 1956, John dropped out of Franklin K. Lane High School, taking with him a sizable chunk of his classmates' lunch money, which he had earned as a class bookie. John got a job as a coat presser and began building upon his criminal resume. At 17, arrested for stealing copper from a construction firm. He pleaded guilty and got probation. At 20, a 60-day suspended sentence for disorderly conduct. In 1960, he met and fell in love with the daughter of a Jewish sanitation worker, Victoria DiGiorgio. Vicky and John got engaged. They were both short-tempered and called it off several times before getting married in March 1962. The couple had 5 children and eventually settled into the Howard Beach section of Queens. Shortly after the wedding, John took a job as a trucker's assistant, but his paycheck didn't cover his frequent nights on the town gambling. Gotti resorted to stealing cars to make ends meet, but the law caught up with him in 1965, and this time, Gotti was sent to prison. With John behind bars and no money coming in, Vicky Gotti went on welfare.
Many people would look at that as an act of weakness while she went on welfare. A lot of other people would look at that as an act of a strong woman sending a signal. Hey, if you guys won't take care of me, you know, I'll take care of it. And, you know, not in a way that, that will make anybody look very good here.
When he was released from prison in 1966, Gotti desperately needed money to support his family. So he turned to a sure thing, hijacking trucks. His hunting ground, JFK Airport in Queens. But Gotti was not too successful in eluding the law. Along with his brother Gene and his best friend Angelo Ruggiero, he was soon arrested. He was sentenced to nearly 3 years in the maximum security federal prison in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. John got out in 1972. He went back to Carmine Fatigo's crew, now operating out of the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club in Ozone Park in Queens. The wise guys at the club called Gotti Johnny Boy.
Gotti presented himself like a man that's been around, you know. Gotti you don't want to mess around with, you know, but he also is very gentle and good-natured, and you know, he'd sit around playing cards.
Gotti's passion for gambling qualified him to run Fatigo's gambling operations, which controlled a few small illegal casinos in Queens. If anyone failed to pay their debts to Fatigo, Johnny Boy roughed them up. Gotti quickly built a reputation as a tough guy and a valuable soldier. So valuable that John was appointed acting capo of the Bergen crew. Gotti was just 31 and not even a full-fledged made man in the Mafia.
It was John Gotti's goal to be boss of the crime family back when he was running a teenage gang back in the 1950s.
As acting capo, John reported directly to Gambino underboss Neil Della Croce.
Della Croce took care of him. Della Croce's relationship with Gotti was like a father and son as opposed to a subordinate to a boss. Della Croce protected him. Gotti did Della Croce's bidding. 100% loyal to Della Croce to the end.
Gotti's rise to glory got a big boost in 1973 after an Irish thug kidnapped and then murdered the nephew of the aging boss, Carlo Gambino.
Carlo Gambino had never received such an instance of utter disrespect in his life. Kill the bastard.
Gotti was chosen to rub out the culprit, James McBratney. When Gotti was arrested, he scored big points in the Gambino family by avoiding what would have been a highly publicized trial and accepting a plea bargain. After spending 3 years in prison, Gotti returned to a crime family straining to get along under the new leadership of Paul Castellano. In the summer of 1976, John Gotti was formally sworn into the Mafia. While Gotti had now control over his own crew, he soon began to lose control of himself. The first sign was his gambling habit.
We have a bug in the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club in Ozone Park. And he's a degenerate gambler, Gotti. He would bet on 2 cockroaches running up the wall. That's how bad he was. He's in the club all by himself Sunday evening, and he gets the result of the baseball games. He lost every one of them. He blew $20,000 plus the VIG. The VIG is the interest, right? He's all alone. What do you think his reaction was to losing $20,000? God is a blankety-blank fag. That's it. We're rolling on the floor laughing.
Gotti became notorious for his temper tantrums.
I walk up the street and I stop in at the club. And there was John. He was sitting at the table. While we're talking, in walks a guy, one of his people, with his hands outstretched, and he has a silver leisure suit in his hands. And as he's walking toward the table, John says, "What is that?" He says, "John, that's the leisure suit you told me to get you, the gray one that you told me to get you." He says, "Is that gray? You ought to kill you and this and that."
Like nearly every other young wise guy, Gotti had a round of girlfriends who were easily impressed with his money.
I know a woman who dated John, who John would take her out, and he said to her, you know, you need anything? Can I, you want you to go shopping? And she says, no. He says, come on, go shopping. He takes out a wad of bills out of his pocket and gives her a whole bunch of money out of his pocket. And she says, John, that's all the money you have in your pocket. And he says, I got 2 pockets.
There was a defining moment in Gotti's family life. In March 1980, just a few blocks from Gotti's home in Queens, his 12-year-old son, Frankie, riding a mini bike, darted out from behind a dumpster and into the path of a car driven by a neighbor, John Favara. The boy was killed. The police ruled it an accident.
One of the factors that apparently or allegedly annoyed Vittorio Gotti was that he never really came and apologized. But he had been warned by others not to apologize. So I think Favara was in the middle of a very untenable situation, unfortunately, and the best advice to him would have been to get out of town very quickly. He had been planning to leave and had just made arrangements to buy a house, but he didn't move quick enough.
Just 2 days before the neighbor was set to move, 3 men beat him and threw him into a van as he was leaving work. He was never seen again. At the time, John and Vicky Gotti were conveniently out of town. No one was ever charged. The John Gotti who took over the Gambino family 5 years after that incident soon became a media superstar and made the mistake of believing his own press clippings. In January 1986, just a month after John Gotti became boss, he made it clear to his associates that he had big plans for the Gambino crime family. He did not know the FBI was listening to every boast. And for a while, it seemed that Gotti really was invincible. No matter what charge was thrown at him, it wouldn't stick. He became known as the Teflon Don. The first 2 trials he faced were for racketeering and assault. In the assault case, prosecutors said Gotti beat up this man named Romuald Pisiak, a refrigerator repairman, and robbed him of $300 following a traffic dispute. John was able to control his emotions in the courtroom, But at home, his wife Vicky was running out of patience, and she let John know it over the phone.
She says, "You haven't been home in 3 weeks. I'm leaving. I don't want any part of this life anymore. When are you coming home?" He said, "Let me tell you something. I'm on trial for this one here. If I beat this, I go on trial for the one in Brooklyn. If I beat both of them, I'll be home in 3 days. If I lose, I'll be home in 35 years. Screw you," and he hangs up the phone.
Winning the assault case was a cinch. As soon as the repairman began reading news reports that the man he was accusing was the new boss of the Gambino crime family, he developed a sudden case of amnesia and could no longer remember who beat him up. The case was dropped. Next came the racketeering case. The government brought in convicted killers and drug dealers who had bargained lighter sentences in exchange for ratting on Gotti. John's attorney, Bruce Cutler, ripped into the credibility of the witnesses. The jury found Gotti not guilty.
Paid witnesses, witnesses who've lied in the past, witnesses who've gotten new identities, witnesses who've sold drugs, witnesses who've killed people.
For the moment, Gotti was a media superstar. He savored his celebrity.
You know, I always felt good.
The whole story of John Gotti took on a life of its own, and I've often said that the media created the superstar John Gotti, because basically we just chased him and chased him. The more he smirked, the more we chased him.
And he made one remark that really stuck out in my head. He said he didn't seek out the media, they sought him out. He was the kind of personality that the media was attracted to. He didn't go look saying, "Wow, I want to be on television, or I want to do this." They wanted to meet him.
Now that he was the boss, Gotti moved his place of business to the Ravenite Social Club in Manhattan's Little Italy.
And he says, "Hey, I ain't gonna hide from nobody. I ain't no laid-down Sally like that old boss Castellano. I'm gonna go to Manhattan. I ain't gonna be hiding from nobody. And you know, we're gonna do business."
The rank-and-file Gambino soldiers saw Gotti as one of them, a hard-working soldier who had fought his way to the top, a welcome change for those who had felt slighted by Paul Castellano.
He was great for morale. You know, he made wise guys feel like wise guys again. He brought back a lot of that esprit de corps that Castellano, and even Gambino to some extent, had seeped out of the family.
On the business side, it was a prosperous time for Gotti and the Gambino family. The rackets were earning the family $500 million a year. Much of the success was due to Gotti's consigliere, or senior advisor, Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano, a thick-necked, gravel-voiced contractor who watched over the old family interests in construction.
He was one of my best friends. We played paddleball one time. He hit the ball. I thought the wall was going to break. He hit it a ton. Wow. The ball broke, as a matter of fact, but Sammy was very, very strong. That's why they call him Sammy the Bull.
It's a little bit surprising that John Gotti would have picked Sammy Gravano. Sammy was someone who did have a little bit on the ball, was young enough to be a threat to John Gotti, but I guess John Gotti never thought that Sammy Gravano would take him down.
Gotti treated Gravano as a brother, someone he could trust with his life.
He always talked about hating rats. Sammy's rhetoric always downrated. Rat, rat, rat.
On FBI tapes, Gotti let Gravano know just how much he cared for him.
For Christ's sake, I love you more. I love myself. For Christ's sake, I love you more than you. I don't give a f myself. You legit?
To the public, Gotti made himself the most visible mob boss since Scarface Al Capone. His perfectly coiffed hair, $2,000 suits, and frequent appearances at New York's hottest night spots painted a picture of a bygone mafia era.
When John Gotti walked into a restaurant, it was an event. 10 people walked into that restaurant. A cashmere coat over his shoulders, dressed impeccably. Everybody stopped and looked around.
He began to believe that he was all-powerful. You know, in one conversation, he and Sammy Gravano were sitting at a table in a restaurant, and John turned to Sammy and he said, "Hey, look at those people over there. They're smiling at me. They love me." And sure enough, Gravano looks over, and there are two young, recently married people looking at John Gotti in awe. The guy gets up and says, "Hello, Mr. Gotti, I really wanted to meet you. I think you're great," and goes back and sits down. And John Gotti tells Sammy, see what I tell you? Everybody loves us.
In January 1989, Gotti was indicted again, this time for ordering the shooting of a construction union agent, John O'Connor. 4 years earlier, O'Connor had sent union thugs into this restaurant to destroy the work of non-union labor. Only the restaurant turned out to be owned by the Gambinos. O'Connor was shot 4 times in the buttocks.
John O'Connor was shot because John Gotti ordered it to teach him a lesson.
To prove its point, prosecutors played surveillance tapes of Gotti repeating O'Connor's address over the phone.
608, John O'Connor. John O'Connor, 608. At 16 something, go away.
And then a garbled sentence the prosecution said was bust him up. The jury was left with reasonable doubt.
How say you with respect to defendant John Gotti, guilty or not guilty?
We find him not guilty.
Gotti was free again and held a fireworks display in Little Italy to celebrate. But the feds were still listening and waiting for the right moment to pounce. As the 1990s began, John Gotti seemed to be making good on his reputation as the Teflon Don. But he did not count on the betrayal of his closest ally, Sammy the Bull Gravano. On December 11th, 1990, Gotti, Sammy the Bull, and John's underboss, Frank Locascio, met for dinner at the Ravenites Social Club. FBI agents were waiting in a car across the street. They had enough taped evidence to bring Gotti and company to trial again. The 3 men were arrested just after 6:30 p.m. Gotti faced a slew of racketeering charges, including ordering 4 murders. One of those murders was the hit on Paul Castellano. Gotti and Gravano were both denied bail.
While Sammy and John were still in prison together, they were both ruminating on ways of getting out of jail. Sammy Gravano gave the suggestion that perhaps they could break out by scaling down bed sheets. And John Gotti thought he was crazy. John Gotti's suggestion was even a little bit more crazy, I think, than Sammy's, and that was to bribe a president. And his suggestion to Sammy Gravano was somewhere down the line, 5 years from now, we put together a $5 million package. We can walk right out the front door. We could bribe a president. And Sammy looked at John, and John looked at Sammy, and the way I get it was they both thought that each other was crazy.
This time, John could not count on his longtime lawyer, Bruce Cutler. The government said Cutler was too close to organized crime. On one tape, Gotti was heard complaining about Cutler's fees.
Where's that? Gambino clan family. This is Chagall, Cutler and Whitaker clan family. You know and I know that they know that you're taking the money to the table. Every time you take a client out, all of a sudden you're breaking the law.
In jail, Sammy the Bull knew he could be implicated in as many as 19 mob hits. That's when Sammy decided to become what he had always said he hated, a rat. He agreed to testify against the boss in exchange for a lighter sentence. Gotti was devastated. At the trial, his closest ally, Sammy the Bull, took the stand and told the world how John ran the Gambino family and how he and Gotti had plotted the assassination of Castellano.
It took a while for Gravano to look over at Gotti, but when he saw the way Gotti was looking at him, it was the same kind of look on his face. It's really hard to describe, but if looks could kill, 2 people would have been dead in the courtroom that day.
The jury took less than 2 days to find Gotti guilty on all counts.
I was with John when he was sentenced. He gets life without parole, and the judge imposes a $50 special assessment. And we're back in the holding cell afterwards, and John's taking off his tie, getting out of his suit. He says, "Boy, that $50 special assessment, they really know how to stick it to a guy, huh?" And he laughs. Life without parole, and he laughs.
Gotti was sent off to the maximum security federal penitentiary at Marion, Illinois. Gravano, after a short prison term, was put in the witness protection program under a new name. The Gambino crime family would never be the same.
John Gotti made a lot of money for himself and his immediate family. In the end, however, he helped bring the Gambino crime family down to a lower level than it had been.
From prison, Gotti made it known in the family that he wanted his son, John Jr., to take over.
John Gotti ended up committing the same crimes within the mob that he so much hated his predecessors for. Why did he hate Paul Castellano? Because he hadn't earned his position. He got it, you know, because of who he was related to. Yet, in the end, what did John Gotti do? He made his son, a relatively inexperienced gangster, not much more than a kid, the boss of the family, surpassing many in higher rank, hundreds with more experience who felt more deserving. So, you know, he became, in many ways, what he loathed.
John Jr., the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree. Here's a guy who has at his disposal, because of his father's name, access to sophisticated type of crime. Computers, high-tech communication system. In fact, there's a lot of mob guys involved in the 900 number scheme, where you call up for sex and whatever, astrology, whatever. And there's a lot of money to be made in that. But this moron is going around with a band of thugs who are hooked into weightlifting and steroids, shaking down bars and discos in Westchester, Bronx, and parts of New York City.
While a lot of the men didn't hold John Jr. in high regard, they didn't challenge him either. Nobody wanted to become the new Gambino boss. The risks far outweighed the glory.
If I'm a mobster with a brain in my head, I don't want that job. Because once you take that job, you're an all-out target for law enforcement. I'd rather stay in the background, earn my money, have my girlfriends, enjoy myself. Why do I need that kind of attention?
The remaining 200 or so Gambino members under John Jr.'s direction still operated many of the street rackets and had clout in the staples of construction and trucking. There to advise John Jr. were some of the family's elders, among them Carlo's son, Tommy Gambino. Over the years, Tommy had risen to the rank of capo, but no further. He shared a remarkable likeness to his father, from his hooked nose to his gentlemanly, polite demeanor. But all of his life, Tommy felt trapped by the legacy left to him.
A White House listening device planted by the FBI picked Tommy up saying this: "Me, I never had the chance to say, well, I'm going to do something I want to do. I always did it for my family, for my children, for my father." That's a very touching statement. Poor Tommy Gambino, he always did what he was told, like a good little boy.
What he was told was to control the garment district. For decades, Tommy had a stranglehold on trucking there. But in 1992, the Gambino grip was broken. Tommy, along with his younger brother and business partner Joseph, pleaded guilty to antitrust charges. They were forced to give up much of their trucking operations. More sorrows came for Tommy in the mid-1990s when he was sentenced to 5 years in prison for running loan sharking and gambling operations.
So the Gambino family really, in many ways, has been stripped of the legendary leadership that they had for many years. I mean, you go back again to what I said, Vincent Mangano, Albert Anastasia, Carlo Gambino, and when I say legendary, I would stop there. Paul Castellano, he tried to wreak a lot of the profits that his brother-in-law left him, and John Gotti just brought the family down.
The family's been shattered. So you have the rise of this enormous criminal organization, then it reaches its apogee in the reign of Carlo Gambino and the reign of Paul Castellano, and then crashes, is destroyed by the reign of John Gotti. I think a final thought may be a quote from Big Paul Castellano: "This life of ours, this is a wonderful life. If you can get through life like this and get away with it, hey, that's great. But it's very unpredictable. There are so many ways you can screw it up." They screwed up in the end.